All right, our final segment of this topic on race and evolution is going to talk about is a history lesson. So again, there's a lot of information out there which I encourage you to explore and read. That's going to be much more eloquently put and detailed than I'm going to give you here, but this is like a starting point. So if you've never thought about this stuff before, I'm going to give you some highlights to kind of spur you forward. So with that, what we'll do is look at three historical events. Um, and then move into kind of some of the laws that were established in colonial times that kind of were the foundation of our modern laws in America, and then some of the evidence and some of the data that suggests the laws that have persisted even into modern times continue to bias advantage towards white people. So our first one's John Punch, then Elizabeth Key, and then Bacon's Rebellion as kind of three big ones. So we'll start with John Punch. This is colonial Virginia in 1640. So here's the first time that we see different kind of discrimination occurring based on descent, right? So you've got three indentured servants. So indentured servants, they are people that are working like slaves, basically, but they have freedom with hope, right? So it's like, I'm going to be your indentured servant for 5 years to pay for my passage across the ocean, and then I'm free to earn a wage and go on. So it's kind of like, I'm going to work off what I owe or what have you. So you've got three indentured servants, and that lifestyle sometimes was horrendous, right? So you've got three indentured servants who run away because maybe it just really, really sucked. Two of them are European and one of them is African. And so John Punch is the African in this group. Well, they're caught because they're kind of breaking their contract and it's illegal. And the Europeans were each sentenced to additional 4 years of service. So it's like, hey, we're going to extend your servitude, your indentured service for an additional 4 years because you tried to run away, and that's not cool. You're not allowed to do that. But the African basically was made a slave. A lifetime of service. No hope of ending that. And this is kind of our first documented evidence to be like, hey, we're differentiating, right, between Europeans and Africans, between what we're starting to call blacks and whites. Our second instance here is Elizabeth Key, right? And this one's a great one because it really shows you about how looking at the law as malleable, right? People in power, people who can control the law are going to change the law to their advantage. So what's the story? This is 1655. So Elizabeth Key, her mother was an African slave, and her father was a white Englishman in Virginia. So he's a landowner. And the thing of it is, she was able to use the law to her advantage, and she sued for her freedom after her father died. Because colonial times were colonies of England, English law is what we have. And English common law said the status of a child is determined by the status of the father. And she's like, my father was a free man. I should be free. I shouldn't be a slave. And by the way, it's illegal to enslave Christians, and I'm Christian. And she won, right? So she's free. And so what did they do? Of course, the people in power freaked out. The elite said, okay, you won your freedom, but we can't have other people doing that. So we're going to change the law. So in 1660, what they said is, hey, we're going to change the law and say that it's the mother's status that dictates the status of the child. And, oh, by the way, you can enslave Christians, right? That's okay. Whatever. We make that okay. So all of a sudden, and also white women were forbidden to have relations with non-white men, right? So basically what they've done is legalize the rape of enslaved women and the enslavement of their children, right? And this is basically what we see hold true through the rest of American history until we break slavery in America. Now, the third point that we want to talk about in the history of the United States is Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion is such a weird, horrible thing. But what we have is a situation here where Bacon and his fellow farmers, right? These are colonists who are like, we are exploring this new frontier. We're carving out farmland, and we're having trouble from the Native Americans because they were here first. And he was complaining because the law said they couldn't just indiscriminately attack and kill the Indians. So basically, he gets pissed because he's like, I want to be able to do what I want and kill Native Americans. So I'm going to get all the farmers together, and we're gonna bring our slaves with us. So they basically said they went to all the slaves and said, "Hey, we want to go after the elite because they're making laws that we don't agree with. Join us in our fight, and if when we win, you'll get your freedom." So ultimately, they were pretty successful at first because they actually torched the capital of Virginia, Jamestown. Like they razed it. You can see in kind of the picture there. And so this was really poignant for, again, those elite in power because what it showed was the power of the people across racial lines, right? So if I can get the mob, the poor, to unite, that's a significant force to be dealt with, and that can ultimately displace us from our power. So that's when other things started to kick in and say we really need to kind of figure out a way to maintain our eliteness. And so we looked at the House of Burgesses. And so the House of Burgesses was the ruling body in Virginia and was very influential in kind of establishing what we then see as the Constitution and kind of modern American law, like through American history. So they started to push things that exacerbated the difference between the races. So in 1682, only Europeans could be citizens. So now all of a sudden you've excluded everyone from everywhere else in the world who wants to come to America. Say, well, you know what? If you want to be an American citizen, you actually have to be European. And then we introduce the language as well. So we start to see white being used to describe full citizens. And it's illegal to marry non-whites, right? So then we don't have any inheritance issues of inheriting land or what have you to someone who's not a white European. In 1705, the Virginia Slave Code basically said that was the kind of birth of our chattel slave system, this idea that people are actually no better than property, and it doesn't matter what you do to them. There's no law that restricts you. You can do whatever you want, which is horrendous, right? So further on, if we make a jump then even further into the future, we see the U.S. Naturalization Act of 1790. So now we're America, the United States of America, independent nation, and basically we said, hey, only white people can be naturalized citizens. And so this was establishing early on in America that if you're going to be an American, you have to be white, right? So that's history there, right? And that's all written down. So now when we talk about citizenship, there's power there. And power and privilege come with voting, land ownership, access to rights of due process, right? So if you wanted to engage the legal system, if you wanted to vote to influence the legal system, if you wanted to do anything, if you wanted to own land, which came with its own power, you had to be white, right? Because you had to be white to be a citizen, and you had to be a citizen to have all these things. You couldn't start a business if you weren't white, if you weren't a citizen. You couldn't sit on a jury of your peers if you weren't a citizen and if you weren't white, right? So really, back then, this is really establishing the foundation of kind of institutionalizing racism in America. Advantage based on race, all loaded towards white Europeans, right? So going even further into modern times, we think about the banking industry, right, and redlining. So in the 20th century, this has a huge impact on the kind of financial inheritance of different groups, right? So what people claimed was they were using historical data sets to predict likelihoods and risk assessment on groups of people. And so the problem is we've kind of already established that we've got a system here that's pretty sexist and racist. And when you put racist and sexist data into an analysis, an assessment, you're going to get sexist, racist data out. And this really led to the phenomenon of redlining. Now, there's a great little video there, and they're not very long, 2 minutes and like 90 seconds each. But I encourage you to look at them, looking at the history of redlining in America, and then specifically in Seattle. So basically, until 1960, it was illegal to live north of the Ship Canal Bridge if you weren't white, right? And so that's why we see now the historical non-white populations in the South of Seattle, in South Seattle, right? So that's really good. It's worth your time to kind of look at. But this idea was that certain zones of the city were deemed white or not white, and you would only sell to those people of a particular group. And oftentimes, almost all cases, the white neighborhoods were the best neighborhoods, and then the richest neighborhoods. So what we're really seeing, to summarize this, a whole lot is out there. And again, this is a lifetime of reading, a lifetime of study. I'm always trying to read more, and you should too. But race was created to uplift white people, right? Basically, what you see is an elite that needs a consistent and reliable, cheap workforce. And if you have your workers banding together, that can be problematic to your ends if your ends are just about making money and maintaining your power. So really, it was the general practice of rich landowners throughout the history of the U.S. To give poor people small advantages, right? Advantages over natives and Africans. So the idea was to say, hey, you look like me. We're the same group, right? Even though I'm incredibly rich and I control you, like we're the same group because we're both white. And so you have just a little bit up on those black people and those native people, right? And that's just enough for a lot of times for people to be like, oh yeah, like I'm getting kicked, but at least I can kick this guy below me, right? And so if you go back to Sapolsky's video and the Baboon Troop, at the end of that, he talks about kind of levels of our circles of hierarchy. And he says the influence there of feeling like you're superior in some of your circles can be really sustaining. So we see that kind of psychological impact here, where as long as I can give you someone else to look down on, you aren't going to, or you're not going to be motivated as much to kind of rebel against the fact that I'm holding you down as well. So what we have here is a switch then of white people to their alliance to other white people, right? As opposed to thinking about the exploitation they're experiencing from the elite. So we've created a multi-class system and a coalition against people of color, right? So you have both rich and poor white people trying to hold their position because we've created a lower position for non-white people. Now, this ultimately goes back to what I asked you at the beginning of all this series, and that is, what is race? What does it mean? Right? So again, there are a lot of blurry lines, and phenotypically we start to get into things like, well, someone's Southern European or Eastern European, are they still white? He doesn't look as white as the guy from this other part, whatever. So what we've really seen, and this really emphasizes the idea that the idea of race is a construct, and a construct created by the elite as a tool, is that they will define white as anything they want it to be. For example, in the 19th century, Finns, people from Finland, were doing some of the lowest paid, unsafest labor in the Midwest and upper kind of Minnesota, Wisconsin, right? That's where you see a huge Finnish population now in the United States. Legally, they were black. Now we're going to learn as we talk about heritage more. I'm Finnish, right? And so my mom actually was born in Finland, so like I'm technically a first generation, because she's an immigrant. But in the mid 19th century, Finns were considered black people by the law. The only group that was lower than them were Native Americans, right? So the courts legally said, hey, you're not white despite your phenotype, despite your skin color, because of your cultural and economic standing. We need to kind of not have the laws of whiteness apply to you because we need you to do this work that we don't want to do. Okay. Now, here's a bunch of Finns. You can see that in the picture, or I guess you see in the picture. They look pretty white to me, right, by our kind of definition of white. So what is white? It's anything that the people in charge want it to be, right? I know these people because that's my family, right? So that's my mother. The baby in that picture is my mother before they came over, right? Yep. So the kicker here, though, is that I'm Finnish. Nobody thinks I'm black, or I have a Finnish heritage. I'm American, but nobody looks at me and says, oh, there's a black guy, because I'm white, right? Clearly, I'm white. The advantage, then, to immigrating from Europe with a skin tone associated with whiteness is that you can phenotypically become white, like you can assimilate, right? So you can transition into your white privilege because of how you look, right? And that's where kind of we've seen such a tag of race and skin color go, because it's such an obvious phenotype and allows us, at least those people in power, to continue to marginalize and suppress those people that don't look like the people in power. Right? So we'll think about this more and talk about it more as we move forward in the future. Thanks.